So glad you're here this evening. My name is Eric Siegel. I'm Director of Education here at the Harn Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Director of the Museum, Dr. Leanne Chesterfield. This evening's lecture is part of the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History lecture series, which presents eminent scholars of art history. It presents museum experts, art critics, and others in the arts, bringing together the work of the Harn Museum of Art and the School of Art and Art History. It was established by a gift from Dr. David A. and Marianne Coffrin to present outstanding lectures and to really raise our level of conversation around art here at the university. The talk tonight is also supported and made possible by the generous support of the Roy C. Craven Jr. Memorial Fund, and we're grateful to both those organizations for support. So, I am thrilled to present African Fashion in Conversation on the occasion of the exhibition Ghanaian Fashion, an exhibition in 3 chapters. Currently on view is the first chapter through June 15th of 2025, which is African Feminism and Fashion. So you'll be able to enjoy that exhibition after the lecture. It, of course, was curated by Christopher Richards here at the far end of the rostrum. Among the many people involved in organizing tonight's event, my partner has been Álvaro Luís Lima, Dr. Lima. He's assistant professor of art history at UF, also affiliate faculty in the Center for African Studies and in the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research. Dr. Lima specializes in modern art and contemporary art from Africa, working at the intersection of art history and cultural studies. His first book project, among other projects he's working on now, is probably titled Farewell to the Future, Art in Mozambique at the End of Socialism. And it focuses on art during Mozambique's transition from Marxist-Leninism to multi-party democracy. Álvaro has also kindly consented to moderate tonight's talk. So please join me in welcoming Álvaro, who will then introduce the rest of our conversationalists.
Good evening, everyone, and it's an honor to introduce the speakers for tonight. Christopher Richard earned his PhD in African art from the University of Florida, so it's especially lovely to welcome you here and celebrate your research accomplishments and the exhibition that you are welcome to see after our conversation. At CUNY Brooklyn College, he is an associate professor of art history and the director of Women's and Gender Studies program. In 2015, he was awarded a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for the Creative Arts of Africa in Johannesburg, South Africa. Richards has held positions and internships at a variety of museums, including the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History and the Museum of African Art. His first guest-curated exhibition, Cabas and Culture and Couture, Contemporary Ghanaian Fashion, was on view at the Harn Museum from February to August of 2015. He co-curated the exhibition Beadwork, Art in the Body at the Wits Art Museum in 2015 as well, and the exhibition of Tahir Karmali's photographic series Value in the Brooklyn College Library in 2016. He is the recipient of the 2017-18 Whitton Award for Excellence in Teaching. Professor Richards has published in a variety of academic journals and exhibition catalogs. His monograph, Cosmopolitanism and Women's Fashion in Ghana, History, Artistry, and Nationalist Inspirations, from Routledge from 2021, models an art historical approach that engages fashion studies, anthropology, history, women's studies, and African studies through archival research and interviews to investigate Ghanaian fashion as a dynamic interaction of local dress styles and materials and global trends, and it's right there. Our second speaker tonight, it's a conversation, so it's not in order, but it's in alphabetical order. Professor Victoria Rovine is professor of art history and director of Public Humanities at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her first book, Bogolan, Shaping Culture Through Cloth in Contemporary Mali, examined late 20th century transformations of a richly symbolic textile. Her second book, African Fashion, Global Style, Histories, Innovation, and Ideas You Can Wear, explores the innovations of designers from Africa, past and present, as well as Africa's presence in the Western fashion imaginary. She's currently at work on a book that focuses on cotton in early 20th century French West Africa, exploring how French colonial administration sought to control and transform the region's weavings. And it is also a special pleasure to welcome Professor Rovine back to UF. Um, Elizabeth, thank you. And last but not least, Elizabeth Wei is curator of costume and accessories at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. Her exhibitions include Black Fashion Designers from 2016, Fresh, Fly, and Fabulous, 50 Years of Hip Hop Style from 2023, Food and Fashion, also from 2023, and African Fashion Diaspora from 24. Wei guest curated and Low, American Couturier at Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library from 2023, and she edited the book Black Designers in American Fashion. Welcome, Wei, to UF. Okay, so I thought that perhaps we could start by thinking a little bit, would like to hear from you about how you got into African fashion history and fashion studies. And perhaps also together with this question, what do you think, in your long careers in African fashion history, what is one of the most exciting things happening in African fashion now?
Eyes look to me, so I guess I should go first. So on the second slide that's going to come up, you'll see a photograph that was taken of me in 2012. So the first time that I experienced African fashion was actually in 2009. I don't know if it was Vicky who told me that I needed to get on a plane and go to Africa, or maybe Robin, but it was made very clear to me that I needed to travel to the continent to experience African culture firsthand. So in 2009, I traveled to Ghana and attended Ghana Fashion Weekend, which was a really important fashion event at the time. I decided for this presentation, I'd bring in a photograph from 2012. So if you see the exhibition, there's quite a few garments by a brand named Christy Brown. The designer is Aisha Yensu. So this photograph is when I first met Aisha. This was the opening of one of her boutiques. And it's just a really special photograph to me because it brings back a lot of wonderful memories. And of course, part of studying and researching fashion is going to events, right? And meeting people and interacting with them. And so I just thought that that would be a nice photograph to share with everyone about sort of where it came from and how it came to be. And then I think one of the things that's so exciting is that I've been talking about African fashion for so long, and now I feel like people are really interested in it. So you have the museum at FIT just did an exhibition. The V&A is traveling an exhibition on African fashion. So it really has kind of come into its own. It's always been there, but it's great to see that so many people are interested and engaged in learning about it, because that's kind of what I wanted to do all along, to educate people about African fashion. So I think that's the most exciting thing for me.
And I will go next. But first, I want to thank Chris for curating this wonderful exhibition. Chris was my PhD advisee, so I'm especially proud to be here and to come back to Gainesville. And also want to thank Eric Siegel and the Harn for inviting me. I am happy to come back on any occasion, so I'm really glad to be here. And also Liz and Álvaro, of course, for participating. And it's great to see Liz again after a long time. So the picture in the middle is one from my dissertation research many, many years ago. And I might say more about this later, but I would just say that I went to Mali having written a Fulbright grant that would have had me studying contemporary studio art. So art that was made to be exhibited in galleries and museums. It was sort of at the cusp of a trend that then became sort of a big part of the field of African art history. But when I got there, one of the media that I saw artists using was a type of textile dyeing technique called Bogolan Fini. It's associated with textiles, not with studio art, insofar as the two are separate, although I would argue they really shouldn't be separated as cleanly as they are. So I began to follow Bogolan. That's sort of where my nose led me. And it also led me to textiles as clothing, not textiles as art to be looked at visually, but not worn on the body. I was more and more drawn to textiles as a worn medium because that's what the people around me cared about the most. It was very hard for me to find people who could comment or be interested in my work with museums and galleries. Instead, everybody was passionate about cloth. So if one wants to study what really matters to the people where one is living, then you would naturally turn to textiles. That led me to this designer whose work you see here on the runway at a big arts festival in Dakar, Chris Seydoux, who I'll say more about later, but I would just say that he was in the vanguard. I didn't know it at the time, but he was in the vanguard of a continent-wide movement towards using distinctively African visual references and materials in fashion design. So I had the chance to interview him and learned more and more and began to get a sense that there was something percolating here. And that led step by step to, I wrote my first book, which was focused on this textile. But then my second book, as you saw, was focused on African fashion design across the continent. So it's just a lesson to anybody in the room who's a student still figuring out what you're doing. Kind of follow your nose. You know, you may think you know where you're headed, but you know, the people around you may help you to find something that's actually going to be more fruitful. So that's how I got interested in African fashion.
Well, I would just like to echo Vicky's thanks to the Harn and Eric, and of course my esteemed panelists. You know, I read so much of your work, like doing research, and so you know, I can't wait to hear about your experiences meeting Chris Seydoux. But I was first kind of interested in fashion from the continent in 2015, and this is an image from an exhibition that I did. I'm a fashion curator and historian, and so working at the museum at FIT, I have to be a bit of a generalist. My personal research focused on the intersection of African American culture and fashion, but this was an exhibition that I co-curated with a colleague on global fashion capitals and this phenomenon that we were observing in 2014, 2015 of really the fact that there was like a fashion week every week and across the world. And so we really wanted to dig into these cities and really think about, you know, were these viable fashion industries or was this more of a media kind of trend? And so one of the cities that I looked at was Lagos. I also looked at Johannesburg. And so that was really my first introduction at looking at these international fashion designers working in the diaspora. And so that was something that I continued to be interested in future shows, Black fashion designers. I included even more designers from the continent, including Christy Brown. We were able to acquire some of those works for the museum at FIT. And then currently, the show I have up now, Africa's Fashion Diaspora, is really about dialogues across the diaspora. So I look at designers in several countries on the continent, as well as North and South America and the Caribbean and Europe, and really thinking about how these dialogues of culture and move across the Black Atlantic and also how they're expressed in fashion. But something that I found really exciting about kind of the current and perhaps future of African fashion is the international recognition that designers from the continent are getting. Lagos Space Program won the Woolmark Prize, Tebe Magugu won the LVMH award, and so they're really showing how talented they are and that they can compete at this international level. And I really think that some of the most exciting and innovative fashion is coming out of these young designers on the continent. So I hope that continues to grow.
Thank you. As African fashion becomes more diffused and gets more attention internationally, as many of you are mentioning, does it change the way in which African fashion is produced or received? I would love to hear about that exchange between, the international market and international reception of African fashion and the way in which it may, create a dialogue with designers in the continent.
I mean, I think I'm on. One thing I would say, as you just mentioned, Liz, I mean, seeing the international profile of these designers going up to the point where Lagos Fashion Week is sort of a must visit on sort of the circuit of fashion weeks, and also in South Africa Fashion Weeks and Morocco. Casablanca Fashion Week. I think that this raises the profile of these designers in their home countries, and makes people feel more sort of like that becomes a source of pride, whether or not you can afford to buy their clothes. It's a source of pride for you to know that their work is receiving this kind of attention on the international market. So in that sense, and also designers who are whose clothing is now marketed in the United States, in Europe, but still for the most part, as far as I know, manufactured in Africa. For many designers, that's an important point in their business plan, in their ethic as designers. So their visibility at home and their visibility abroad build together, I think, you know, in a really important and exciting way.
So Liz and I were just talking about this before we came into the space, but so when you go to the exhibition and you see Christy Brown, one of the things that's really amazing about her as a designer and her brand is that she produced everything in Ghana from when she started the brand in 2008. And she had her own clientele. So she was incredibly successful as a businesswoman without having to sell outside of the country. So people from Ghana, Nigeria, other neighboring countries, they would buy from her, and literally she would release a collection and it would sell out immediately. So it's been really interesting to see how her brand has changed. So now she is selling internationally, but she's selling direct to clients. So if someone wants to buy something, they just buy it online. So the internet has changed, social media has changed things so much. But I think what's really incredible, particularly about some of the designers in the exhibition, is that they have just made garments in the countries, and that's always been really important for them, for their brand to really produce and benefit their communities. And now the world has sort of caught up to them, right? So now the world is interested, but they've always been really successful and creative and innovative.
And I found that, you know, young designers based on the continent kind of fall into some of the same kind of patterns that fashion designers everywhere fall into. Fashion is a really tough business. And when you get a lot of media attention, sometimes the demand blows up, and production is hard to kind of keep up with. But I do think that so many of the designers, because they're so heavily invested in producing locally, in local textiles, and a lot of these means of production are kind of inherently sustainable as well, which also makes them really interesting to consumers. They kind of push back against the fashion industry, and you know, in the ways that, you know, we've been talking about in New York for forever. Like, when is this cycle going to slow down? All of that. For example, I'm wearing this now from Orange Culture in Nigeria. This is made to order. So they partner with an online retail platform, Industry Africa, and you order it and you have to wait a month to get it. So they're not having to, you know, fill stock lists that are in demand 1 month and find that demand is dropped off, and then they don't have any sell through, and, you know, the stores want to return things. Like, these are things that have plagued fashion designers for decades. So they're trying to find more sustainable ways of making fashion, not only in terms of the environment, but just in terms of business.
Looking at the different images that you brought up about your work, you know, a lot of them have references that are legible to me as traditional in some way or another. And I would love to hear from you what you think about this dialogue between, you know, the changes that at least I associate with the fashion industry, and this negotiation with tradition and African traditions.
So tradition, Vicky will echo this, I think, because she obviously mentored me. Tradition is a really complicated concept. And I think one of the things that I have always tried to promote in my writing is that we think of tradition as something that is stagnant. And that's not the case. When you talk about tradition in Ghana, Ghanaians see tradition as something that can change. It can be malleable. And so something can be traditional like kente cloth, but kente can change. The colors can change, the styles can change, it can be tailored. So I think this idea of holding on to something that is culturally meaningful and historically meaningful is important, and that can be traditional, but it doesn't mean that it can't change, right? And that I think tradition has more so to do with materiality of something, right? So for Christy Brown, and I think we can probably show another photograph to get people interested in some of the images. Let me think about, if we can go to number 19. So those are some images that are by So the garment on the left is in the current exhibition, so you can see that. So this is a Batakari smock. So Batakari smocks are historically worn by men. Aisha decided to transform it into a very provocative women's garment for the runway. And so this is something that would be considered traditional, but it can be amended, right? And then for Aisha, so Aisha grew up in the capital city of Ghana, which is on the coast. And she grew up, and what she would say to me is that kente cloth was not what she saw her family wear. They wore wax print. So for her, wax print is her tradition. And so she often incorporates wax print in her designs. And so you can see wax print in the center garment. And then the garment on the right is actually in the museum at FIT's collection. I brought that back, funny enough, for the museum at FIT. And so you can see that even though she's using wax print, she's also using wax print that's not conventional. When we think of wax print, we think of these really bright, sort of contrasting colors, but she chose a pattern that is more subtle. It has white and cream. So I think Aisha is really aware of this idea of using things that might relate to cultural heritage and what we call tradition, but ensuring that it does change and it shows that there's some room for malleability over time.
So I would say, can we go back to the first slide just for a moment, and then I'll skip ahead to another slide. And I'll just say a word or two about the designer of the garments that you see on the cover of my book. There we go. Whose name is Maimouna Diallo, who is a Bamako, the capital of Mali, Bamako-based designer, whose work I found really, really interesting. This is a picture from a fashion show in Niamey, the capital of Niger. It's a big show that hasn't happened in a couple of years. It's a festival, an international festival of African design that was first founded by a very well-known Malian Nigerian designer who was based in Paris, which in itself is kind of an interesting insight into the cosmopolitanism, to use Chris's book's title as a reference, of African designers. So she makes a kind of garment that's called a bubu. It's a classic dress form in much of West Africa. It has different names in different parts of Africa, but it's a large, untailored garment or gown that comes in a man's size and a women's size, and when it's more formal, it's often richly embroidered. So these are richly embroidered. And if you didn't really know too much about what you were looking at, you would say, oh, well, that's tradition. There's nothing complicated here, it's traditional. And the women who wear it, these are in high demand among sort of an elite class of women in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Senegal. She is a very successful designer. But when you meet her and you talk to her and you look more carefully at the garments, they're drawing influences from all over. And this particular line of bubus, if you were a Malian woman, or if anyone in the room is from that part of West Africa, you would probably look at these and say that's kind of atypical, because she was looking actually at beadwork from South Africa when she designed these bubus. And it's not directly copying by any means, but she was reading books and looking at articles about Zulu beadwork, which is also very sort of bold, abstract, geometric designs, and that's what inspired this line of bubus. So I find this a really interesting image for talking about, yes, there's tradition, right? But tradition means many different things to many different people. I think of it as more of a process than an attribute that is tied to certain forms and remains tied to them throughout their lifetime. So I'll go on just a little, and if you could go up to number, I think it was 31, and I'll just say just a little bit more about Bogolan Fini. So that's Chris Seydoux's work, and I've already kind of introduced you to him. I want to say a little bit more about him. He's Malian. He's from a small, he's deceased now, but he was from a small town just north of Bamako in the heartland of a region where they make Bogolan Fini, this very distinctive textile. So he was raised with it. He was around him when he was growing up. His mother was a seamstress, and he would spend a lot of time in her workshop, and he would read fashion magazines, and he became fascinated by fashion. I won't go over his whole biography. One thing leads to another. He ends up in Paris, where he's working in the sort of large workshop of some really renowned French designers. When he came home to Mali on a visit, someone put a piece of Bogolon in his suitcase as a gift for him, and he came back to Paris. When he saw it in Paris, it meant something different to him, right? And so he was looking at it with new eyes as someone now based in Paris and a designer, and he began to think about using it for fashion, which was not an uncomplicated thing to do, because the cloth, let's go forward one more. I'm skipping a little bit here. By the time I got to Bamako in the early 90s, artists, as I mentioned, were using this textile dyeing technique to make fine art. So that's how I first encountered it. This is a work by, if you go to the next slide, a group of artists. These are two of the artists here, very, very, very famous group of artists. All of this was happening in the immediate aftermath of a popular uprising in 1991 that overthrew a government, and there was a really vibrant feeling of pride in Mali's new democracy. So all of this is part of the story. So if we go forward, this is what the cloth looks like in its classic form, and it's made to be worn as a wrapper, like a skirt by a woman. Next slide. I'll try to go very quickly here. So I'm just showing you some examples. This one is actually, I have the wrong date. That's late 19th century, not late 20th century. So this cloth has a long history, if we keep going. Made by women, its symbols have specific meanings. It's deeply rooted in Bamana culture. Keep going. This is how it's made. This is an artist, Nakunte Jara. It's made by, I won't go into the whole technique, but it's very complicated. It involves dyeing cloth with leaves and then painting in fermented mud on the cloth in very specific patterns. Keep going. Here she is again. She's making a garment here, and the next slide shows what the garment is. That's the garment. It's a tunic made for a hunter. I actually commissioned this from her. It's in a museum where I used to work. Now, it's protective. It's spiritually protective. It's believed to be imbued with spiritual power. So for Chris Seydoux to cut this cloth and stitch it into mini skirts and halter tops was very controversial in Mali. So what did he do? He commissioned women to make the cloth all in one pattern, instead of the cloth I showed you a minute ago, which had 5 different patterns. That made it easier for them to understand what he was doing and for him to cut the cloth. So if we keep going. So here's some more of his designs. At first there was some controversy, but then he became just about the most famous person in Mali in a good way. Next, zooming through. Then he began working with a textile factory in Mali, which no longer exists, but they commissioned him to design a cloth that could be mass produced on cotton fabric by the thousands of meters, so that Mali's association with this pattern would be retained. Why? Because, next, here's where I'm going to stop, because those patterns and those colors were diffused, to use a gentle word for it, were appropriated by designers all over the world without any reference to or acknowledgement of their roots in Mali. So for many of these designers, using local fabrics is not only a point of pride, but also a point of kind of a moral stance that it should remain somehow rooted to our culture. So these are just 2 of about 1 billion examples I could show of this kind of picking up, dropping in a new place in a way that's very different from what Maimouna Diallo did in my first slide, where she's inspired by South African beadwork, but she's not copying it without crediting it. So in terms of tradition, that's where I will stop. That I find it very fascinating how meanings of things change according to context.
I'm going to go to slide 28 and pick up kind of just show slightly more examples of exactly what Vicky is talking about. This is a section in the exhibition that I have up right now, and it's called Monumental Cloth. And I borrow this phrase from Sonia Clark, who talks about how cloth is such an important piece of cultural production on the continent and in the diaspora, analogous perhaps to Westerners. The power they imbue in monuments. And so it makes a lot of sense that traditional textiles are, and again, traditional is a really complicated word, are used within this fashion practice. But what I found in my research and looking at contemporary designers is that fabrics that read kind of much more straightforwardly traditional are actually used much more in the diaspora than on the continent. So many designers, and this image shows designers from the Ivory Coast, from South Africa, and Nigeria, are taking these patterns, these ways of making cloth that have been passed down from generation to generation, and making them contemporary, making them fashion. Because a lot of these cloths that are very formal, they're reserved for special occasions. And so it's not something like you'd say that you just cut up and make into a contemporary piece of clothing. So they're reworking them. And if you go to the next slide, this is a really great example. This is a Kwete cloth, and this is from a design brand called Emi Casbit, designed by Emmanuel Okoro. And this is a cloth that's traditionally woven in southeastern Nigeria by the Igbo people in the Abia state. And so Emmanuel Okoro is also from the Abia state, and he was studying fashion when he kind of fell upon this fabric that he'd been familiar with, but was able to look at it in a new light as a maker. And so he commissions this cloth from the women who weave it. It's only woven by women. It's taboo for men to weave it. And he commissions it in colors that are new, that fit into his design vision. And he talks about how important it is for him to talk to these artisans in their own language, commission these cloths, talk to them about the patterns that they've made for generations and how they can change them and modernize them for his design purposes. And then he takes it all back to his studio in Lagos and tailors them into his designs. Or if you go to the next slide, this piece by Tebe Magugu, he's taking the idea of commemorative cloth, which is a wax print that traditionally, commemorates famous people. I've one in the exhibition from Mali that commemorates the election of Barack Obama. But he brings it down to the personal level because this cloth is instead of images of famous people, it includes images of his mother, his grandmother, and his aunts who inspired this collection. So you find the ways in which designers are really taking these motifs and making them their own, making them kind of accessible for fashion, much more in places like Colombia or, in the United States or in the Caribbean. We see kind of straightforward adoptions of wax prints because that means something different to them in the diaspora than it might on the continent.
Can I just add one thing since we're talking about cutting and tailoring? So if we go to slide number 7, so one of the things that I always like talking about is that when people talk about kente in Ghana, people said Ghanaians never cut and tailored it. Kente is a prestige garment. It's often worn by chiefs or very elite individuals, right? And so most of the time for my career, when I was studying African art, people said you would never cut and tailor kente. So when I started doing my research in Ghana and working in the archives, I realized that wasn't quite true, right? So what's interesting is that in the image on the left, it's from 1957. It shows how Ghanaian women would have worn kente. Typically, they wore it as a wrapper around the waist. The idea is that as a wrapper, it's not cut and tailored, and it maintains this form that we think is, again, this idea of being static. But Ghana gained independence in 1957, and immediately after that happened, you start seeing women cutting and tailoring kente into fashionable garments. So the image on the right is the first known example of a woman who wears a cut and tailored kente garment. And if you look really carefully, you'll see that there's kente that lines or that forms the collar of the dress, and then there are these big strips on the skirt. And that's really unusual because that means that the woman was actually using either strips of kente or pieces to create this garment. So that's even more sort of avant-garde and unconventional, but it makes sense at the time, right? Because Ghana had just gained independence. People were celebrating that they were free from colonial rule. So why wouldn't you want to wear your heritage, right, in a new and innovative way? And if you look, I'll just give you 2 more tidbits about kente. So if you go to the next slide, this garment is actually in the Harn's collection. So this is a kente kaba. So the kaba is an iconic form of women's dress in Ghana. It consists of a tailored blouse and usually a tailored skirt. And Shea Julie was Ghana's first formally trained fashion designer. And so this is her version of a tailored kente ensemble. What's really interesting about it is that she tailored the top, but she left the skirt untailored. So it's this kind of negotiation between what we would consider to be traditional and then very modern and fashionable. And I will say that, so the Shea Julie was deceased before I started doing my research, but her sister is still alive. Her sister is the one who wore this, and her sister wore it and wore it and wore. She loved wearing this ensemble. And she said to me that when she first wore it, which was in the late 1960s, her husband's family was very upset because they said, "You're ruining your kente cloth," right? And she said, "No, I didn't ruin it. I'm going to wear it again and again and again." And she did. So I think there is this prevailing idea, even in Ghana, that there are certain things that you're maybe not supposed to cut and tailor, but women were certainly engaged in doing that. And then the last image I'll just show you to kind of think about at least kente cloth is number 15. So this is a really beautiful coat that was designed by Kofi Ansa. Kofi Ansa is one of the most well-known Ghanaian fashion designers. He's also the subject of the second exhibition, which will be opening next year. And what Kofi Ansa did, he often talked about how he had to prove himself as a Ghanaian and as an African who was living and working in London. He said he had to learn the ways of sort of European couture so that people would accept him. And so I think what he often did was he would approach fashion in a very subversive way. So this is kente cloth, but when you look at it, you wouldn't necessarily think it's kente because it's not the colors that we associate with it. And he told me, and I think this will probably come out in the next exhibition, I remember him saying to me that he wanted people to appreciate his clothing for the quality and the silhouette, and then later find out that it's African. So I think there's this subversive quality to his approach, and then this idea of kind of challenging what people think of as being African. And yet this is kente cloth, right? So again, this idea of it doesn't have to fit into this box that we think is tradition, I guess. This is still traditional in some ways, but in very unexpected and unconventional ways.
And I think that there is a way in which this terminology of tradition, which I think is so pervasive in African and art history and anthropology, skews to a particular kind of visibility of these objects, right? That often feels somewhat unsatisfactory, right? And I think you're showing cases in which this use of quote unquote tradition is also a way of rethinking the politics of the present, right? Like by making historical references sometimes, right? So I would love to hear more about that. And I'm thinking of, for example, the drum. Very direct historical reference as a kind of a way of rethinking the politics of the present, but also Professor Richards, you were mentioning in when we were walking the exhibition a little bit more about the kente when the first president of independent Ghana, Nkrumah, comes to give a speech of independence and wearing kente cloth, and the significance of that as well as kind of a reappropriation of the past, right? And you know, Professor Rovine, you also mentioned that the politics of Bogalan also changing with the political situation in Mali at the time that you're doing your research. So I would love to hear more on that with the beautiful examples that you've been showing.
Well, I want to say just one. I want to give one more example about kente. Can you go to slide 24? Because like there's been the Fowler Museum did an exhibition on kente, I guess, in the 90s, and they did this beautiful, beautiful book. But the piece I want to point out is kind of in the center cluster of 3 on the right. This is a piece by Patrick Kelly, who's a Black American fashion designer, who's working in Paris in the 1980s. And he was very well known for kind of directly confronting tropes about negative stereotypes of Blackness, and particularly linking about the American South and his upbringing in Mississippi. And so he applies that same treatment, and he often used a lot of humor. It was very tongue-in-cheek, and he applies the same formula to this ensemble, and it's like these nylon stretch pants patterned in a kente pattern. So kente is woven. This is a stretch fabric, and then he also has like this basket-shaped hat with this kente trim. And so I think this is such a fascinating piece of fashion design because kente really, it's a very specific cultural object for a cultural group that kind of enlarged to kind of represent Ghana as a free nation, and then traveled across the Atlantic to kind of represent this Pan-African idea, especially among Black Americans. And so here we see Kelly kind of embracing it as his culture. But there are probably many Ghanaians, and in the book that the Fowler Museum, there were a lot of interviews with people who made kente and their opinions on it. And a lot of people would argue that this is not Black American culture, that he is appropriating this. And so I really think it's an interesting piece to kind of think about that tension across the diaspora and the ways in which these fabrics that are meant to represent tradition are kind of traveling through the world and through different meanings according to the different designers. But we were talking about Drum Magazine on slide 27. So this is a really interesting ensemble. This is by a Johannesburg-based fashion brand that is no longer operating, called Stone Cherry. And it was designed by Nakahensi Nkosi, and it was established around 1999 or 2000, so about 10 years into the post-apartheid period about. And she was really adamant that in order for Black South Africans to move forward as a nation, as a culture, they really needed to look to the past. And so she commissioned the covers of Drum Magazine, which was a pictorial magazine like Ebony or Life. That was one of the only media outlets that was really capturing the creative lives of Black South Africans within the townships. And so this was her way of kind of teaching history to her kind of fellow citizens through fashion. And we acquired this at the museum in 2016, and we asked for an entire ensemble because separates are really hard for us to show. And so she paired it with this Tsonga skirt, which is not a product of her brand, but something that she envisioned this t-shirt being styled with. And so I think this is a really interesting way to think about history, and really a more recent history for the people wearing this. This would have been their grandparents or maybe even their parents' culture. A really interesting way to kind of use history as this cultural tool and include it in fashion.
Maybe I'll pick up from that and say something else about Stone Cherry. Which is that when this brand became very, very popular, it was very closely associated with Sophiatown, which was a neighborhood outside Johannesburg. That was a multiracial neighborhood that predated the laws, the beginnings of the apartheid government's restrictions on race and where people could live. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that as sort of the hallmark of apartheid. And Sophiatown predated that. It was Jewish, it was Black, it was white, it was South Asian, and it was also a hotbed of cultural creativity. And there are lots and lots, in fact, Drum Magazine grew out of that neighborhood, and her clothing looks to that period. So while she's designing, she and her sort of atelier of designers were working with sources of inspiration that were the photographs in Drum Magazine from the 1930s, when it was like a hub of jazz and journalism and creative writing. Sophiatown was then destroyed by the apartheid government, and people were forcibly removed. So by looking back to Sophiatown, that's tradition, even though that tradition is a global Black kind of a Harlem Renaissance kind of an aesthetic, right? So I find it really interesting that that's tradition, right? Because it's a specific time, it's a specific place, it's looked back to with nostalgia for many South African people. So I thought that was a very interesting move for her to create something distinctively South African that doesn't involve beadwork, that doesn't involve Ndebele, sort of a cultural group that creates beautiful beadwork and wall painting. That's not her version of tradition. Her version of tradition is a moment in South African history that means something to people. Right. So I think our points here really echo each other, and it shows you the complexity and the sort of the intellectual power of fashion design when we think about it this way.
That made me want to take a turn to slide 11. I feel like I should tell some stories about my time in Ghana, so I don't know. Anyway, so this is a designer I've worked with for a long time as well. Her name's B. Arthur. She's not on the Golden Girls. What's really interesting about B. Arthur is that she is Ukrainian and Ghanaian. So again, here is someone who lived in 2 different countries, who sees herself as absolutely Ghanaian and absolutely Ukrainian, right? And so her designs reflect that. And so if you look at the image on the right, this was a garment that she first presented at that 2009 Ghana Fashion Weekend. And what's so beautiful about it is that it includes the Russian Matryoshka dolls, which she grew up learning about and seeing, right? And then she changed the garment at the bottom, so that has pieces of batikari in it. So we talked about the batikari smock. So she cut that apart and then put them into the dress. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the Matryoshka was really a symbol of her brand, and she would often include them in these garments. And you can also see something that I think Álvaro might want us to talk about, but this idea of sort of recyclia. So B is really interested in reusing and reimagining her garments. So this is when the garment was first presented on the runway, and you can see the bottom of it was different. So what makes B really unusual is that she is always keeping these garments and reworking them and reconfiguring them. And, she really sees herself as an artist, and these are her canvases. So she's constantly sort of repainting and reworking. And she's just a really interesting figure. But again, it speaks to the complexity of African identity, right? Kind of what you were talking about in South Africa. So, I mean, and she's just a really interesting character.
One of something else that I wanted to hear from you is that a lot of even the images that we see are of garments on display at museums or exhibitions. And how do you think of that? What changes in our experience of fashion? Typically I would, someone who is completely outside of this field, I would associate it with a fashion show. And what happens in that transition, and what are the challenges also of, many of you have curated shows, and what are the challenges of exhibiting fashion in a museum or in a gallery space?
I think what I like about when I see fashion on the runway, it really comes to life. So let me just show you, I guess we can go to slide 16. So this is actually from the first fashion show that I ever attended, and this also relates to what Vicky was talking about. So Confiança, I don't want to go too far into the rabbit hole. This will be in the second show, but Confiança, I think, created garments that were fantastical because he knew that global audiences wanted something that looked African, that sort of stereotypical idea. And so he would lean into certain materials. So, Ghanaians don't wear Bogalon, but he created a collection around Bogalon. And when he told me about this collection, he said, this is what Malian warrior princesses would wear meeting the Tsar of Russia. Which is pretty, just think about that. That's pretty wild, okay? It's very descriptive and very evocative, but really wild. So, I mean, seeing these garments on a mannequin is one thing. But when you see women walk the runway, when you see the movement of the fabric, it just really brings it to life and brings it together and makes it, I think, so much more impactful. And then and these images are in the exhibition if you go to slide 18. So I was lucky enough to attend Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week to see one of the runway collections for Christy Brown. And again, so the interesting thing about her designs is that a lot of them have a kinetic quality to them, meaning that you can't really appreciate them unless they're being worn on the body and there's movement. So she has a lot of pieces that sort of flutter or float or just move with the natural movement of the body. So you lose that on the mannequin. When you see it on a woman or on the runway, you get that sense and it really brings the garment to life. So I always like seeing people wear it. And I think that's also nice just to remind you when you go to the exhibit, there's a video of an array of Christy Brown's clients who talk about what it's like to wear her clothes. And then they also are modeling them and they're moving, and you get a sense of how beautiful and how vibrant the clothing really does look on the body.
I would just add that as Africanist art historians, Chris and I and Robin and Susan have spent a lot of time thinking about and teaching what we call classical, I'm putting scare quotes around it, African art, by which we mean the kind of objects that were made in Africa and made for use often in political or religious or domestic settings that were around the turn of the 20th century discovered, even bigger scare quotes, by Europeans and exploded their minds. People like the early modernists, Picasso, you all know this story, and began to give people the opportunity to think about representation in new ways. Kind of translating the world into geometries. Well, they didn't understand the original context of those objects at all, and they didn't think they needed to. But for us as Africanist art historians teaching that material, it's very frustrating and difficult because it's always been appreciated in isolation from its cultural context. And that's what made it fine art, right? That's what made it high art in a European setting. Well, what I'm getting at here is that I think fashion faces the same challenge, the same difficulty. It's made to be seen on bodies in motion. It almost makes me think that art history as a whole could learn a lot from these challenges, because so much art that we think of as fine art that we put in museums in isolation from its original context would benefit from a much fuller context. And we all face the challenge. And I think in your exhibition, having that video that you just mentioned is immense. It's huge. You're getting to hear from people who are wearing it, so you see it on their bodies, and they're telling you what it means to them, right? So I think I can't speak about art history all over the world, although I will anyway. And I'll just say, altarpieces and objects that were made to be placed on shrines and things like that, we show them in isolation. That's a whole different aesthetic. And we've come to accept that, I think. It's a different aesthetic. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying it's different. And if you don't know what the difference is, then you're missing a lot. So my whole point here is that I think fashion as an art historical study and the study of classical African art should be looked at as a form of representation, and maybe think about, can we apply that to art forms that we think don't need that, but really they do, right? So I think it's a very, very interesting question.
And there's been a lot written in kind of fashion studies about, what it means to put a piece of clothing that is vibrant, that has a life, into a museum. And people have said, fashion museums are like graveyards for clothes, like this where they go to die. And so that's a challenge that we consistently work with as fashion curators. And so one thing that we have to think about is mannequins. I am not a conservator. Our conservators do an amazing job mounting these shows. If you go to slide 33, you can see examples like mannequins are just mounts. And so paintings have mounts, ceramics have mounts. Most of the time they can be a little bit more invisible than a mannequin can be for us. There are ways to invisibly mount clothing so you don't see a body, but that's really time consuming. And so we have to think about how, for us, it's just a mount to show the clothing, but it's impossible to separate this from a human body because that's how clothing are worn. And so we have to think about the ways in which mannequins are representing bodies and who they're representing. For example, in my exhibition, I only use shaded mannequins. That's how we refer to them at FIT. Is we have four shades of mannequins. We have paper white, and then we have these tones that are a little closer to skin tones. And so that has really had a huge impact on our audience in the ways that they kind of relate to the fashions on display. It also just aesthetically looks better. Paper white is a really hard color to show anything on. And so in that way, we do have to kind of concede that these are clothes in motion, even though we try to protect them and keep them as static as possible. But we also, fashion has really fought really hard to have a place in, especially art museums. My museum is just a fashion museum, so we don't have those conversations. But I think something that's a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, is that a lot of the pieces in my show are by contemporary contemporary fashion designers, and their things are on sale. And I hope that people come through and like them and go to their websites and buy them and become a part of kind of this fashion culture. But that's been something, going back to the 19th century that, that was dirty, that was commercial, that wasn't high art. And this separation between, what is high art and what is useful, utilitarian, and not art is something that I think that we're trying to rethink in museums.
I think the nice thing about having an exhibition on fashion is that when you see somebody that you like how they're dressing, you might say, oh, I like how you dress, but you're not going to go up and be like, wow, can I look at the seams, or can I look at how that was cut? And I really want to know more. But when you have it on a mannequin, like in the show, you actually can go up and say, okay, I really want to look at how this was made. Where are the stitches? What was something that was done? Let me look at the material. So I think there is a positive aspect to having it on display, because then as a visitor, you really can have time to look at it and to think about it. So you can see it in motion, but you can really contemplate the beauty and the materiality of fashion, which we often don't get to do on a day-to-day basis, right? We might appreciate what someone is wearing, but we don't think about it beyond that. And having it in a museum really gives you that space and that time, which I think is important, because then it develops, people can develop an appreciation for materiality and for dress, right?
It seems like African fashion and Africa as an idea is often being referenced outside of Africa in Western fashion, and you both gave different ways in which that is reference, and not necessarily always in a negative way. I would love to hear your thoughts about that dynamic of exchange between Africa and the globe.
Can we start with slide 21? Is that okay if I start with that? So I think Vicky will echo this, probably Liz as well. One of the most, I think, impactful fashion shows of a European designer was Yves Saint Laurent's 1967 Haute Couture runway collection. It's one of the first times, I mean, there were earlier examples, but this is probably one of the most celebrated examples of when a European designer fantasized about Africa. So I want to make it really clear. This has nothing to do with what Africans were wearing, right? Or what they wear now. This is a total fantasy. It's informed by African forms, and you can see the use of raffia, some of the beading. But I actually think this was, and I don't know if anybody's actually written about it in this way, Vicky, or I think this was pivotal. I think this was maybe when the fashion industry started thinking about African fashion in this way, meaning that African fashion had to have lots of prints. It had to have natural materials like raffia. It had to have beadwork. It had to have these crazy hairstyles. And so this, I think, has really had a long legacy of influencing how we conceptualize of what African fashion is, divorced from the continent.
And I would say you can actually go back further. That's which, just to point out, I would maybe point to someone like Paul Poiret, very famous French designer, who was actually associated with Josephine Baker. Interestingly, some of you may be familiar with her, who herself was a very complicated representation of Africa for European audiences because, well, I don't want to go into it. She's from St. Louis. She did go to Africa as an adult, but anyway, she represented a savage Africa. So she was a source of inspiration for Paul Poiret, among others. And also, I'll just point out, you know, in my own work on this line of clothing, the way this clothing was presented in the press makes it impossible to call it some kind of innocent sort of fascination and appreciation for Africa, because whether it was Yves Saint Laurent or the folks who did the promotional writing that accompanied this line of clothing, I won't go into it, but I mean the words that were used in association with this are pretty shocking, in terms of words that have to do with images of enslavement and cruelty and confinement, and it's very disturbing. But maybe I would skip ahead to a happier view of sort of the role of Africa in global fashion. If you go to number 48, and I don't know whether Liz and Chris are familiar with this, Yegwa Ukpo, right? And this blog post that he wrote, which I have my students read early in the semester in my classes on African textiles and fashion. It's called Nigerian Fashion is Fashion Without Teeth, by which he means he's critiquing the work of the Nigerian designers he's mostly seeing around him, saying that they're not bringing anything new. They're not contributing anything new to the global fashion scene. Next slide. And I'll go through this quickly. I have quotes from the blog, but I won't take the time to read them, but I would recommend reading it if you're interested. This is Yegwa Ukpo himself wearing some of his own designs. And this clothing will become a little clearer when we think about what he's asking for, what he's calling for. So next slide, and we're going to actually skip this slide. So go ahead. This is just about how he defines fashion. He uses as an example of a designer who is bringing something new from their own cultural heritage and really making a meaningful contribution to the global fashion scene. He talks about Rei Kawakubo, who's a Japanese designer who founded the brand Comme des Garçons, which is a renowned and much respected kind of conceptual fashion brand. And this is one of her most famous lines. Everybody who studies fashion knows the Lumps and Bumps collection, which she did in 1997. And what's so interesting about this is the way it subverts your idea about what fashion should do. So it's not giving you a comfortable feeling about the way bodies and clothing interact, right? And it's very dramatic. It's very dramatic. And he complements that, and he says her work is the result of deep, deep cultural roots in Japanese aesthetic, Japanese history of ceramics and other art forms. So the next slide. So what is wrong with Nigerian fashion according to Ukpo? Go ahead. Our designers seem to be devoid of strong voices and visions, well-intentioned, ethnic and tribal. His use of scare quotes leaves leaving a trail of colorful Dutch wax print work. We could talk a lot about how designers feel about Dutch wax print or African print, which has a very complicated history, and Chris has already mentioned it. So next part here, he's talking here about how we've been distanced from our own history. Right? The history of colonialism from the late 19th century to 1960 has separated us from our own history. How can any sort of culture develop in this type of environment? Next slide. So here's what he's calling for. We need to bring our own contribution to generate any work of any value. We have to have a grip on contemporary and historic culture. So here's where he's looking back to the next slide. He's looking back to Nigerian dress practices. He's not looking back all that far. In fact, he could look back much further than this. But he's looking at clothing. He's calling on Nigerian designers to look at what's distinctive here. What can we bring to the global fashion market? These are just some examples. And then the next slide. He talks about how it's wrapped, it's tied, it's knotted. We don't see seams. We don't see stitches. The use of fabric ornamentation and jewelry is very distinctive. That's what leads him to his own designs. That's what leads him to think, what can we do as Nigerians? It's not about African print and Dutch wax print. He's calling for something else. So I just want to point out, I like his idea of thinking about, does your fashion have teeth? Right? Are you bringing something that's distinctively your own to the global fashion world? And next slide. Oh, we can go ahead, skip ahead a little bit, sorry. These are the kind of Dutch wax prints that he's sick of. Although I'm not saying that they're all bad. I'm not simply going to throw them all out. Next. So this is the kind of designer we've mentioned. Lego's space program, Ajegu Thompson, who's the designer. This is Yegwa Ukpo, the person whose work we were just reading, wearing an ensemble from this designer's 2018 line of clothing called Awo Workwear. And what is Awo Workwear? Next slide. It's about divination. It's about Yoruba diviners who are called Babalao. And Awo, Robin, can you translate Awo? Awo. What? Sacred. Sacred workwear. And, sorry, Awo. Of course, Babalao, Awo. Secret workwear. And so he's looking to what the Babalao wear, but he's not reproducing it in any way, shape, or form, right? It's a source of inspiration. So he's saying, I can bring my distinctively Yoruba, Nigerian aesthetic. So the next slide, and then I'm going to stop. Oh, this is another example of the horrific adaptation. I'm going to skip it. Go back. Go back. I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. Go back another one. We can leave it on that. We'll leave it on that. And I'll stop there. Just so I'm introducing you to one thinker / designer's conception of what Africa should be bringing to global fashion.
Something I think that's so interesting about that is that Deji Thompson, his fashion practice for like a space program revolves around adire, which is an indigo dyeing techniques. Yeah, you can show it if you want. But what, as correct me if I'm wrong, because you would know better, that
Number 63.
the way in which adire, which is indigo dyeing, was they dyed
63.
European-made cloth. Like
Yes.
so,
Yes.
I mean, so many of these whatever things that are traditional, like, or they don't go back as far as you think. Or I was talking about Akwete earlier, like those were made, those cloths were woven from European cloths that were unraveled and rewoven because the thread was stronger. But I just want to go to back to slide 33. And talk specifically about this piece in the front. This is by a brand called Katouche based in Nairobi. And there's an amazing fashion stylist, creative director named Sunny Dolet from Kenya, who talks about specifically Kenyan style as being much more subdued than is generally associated with African style. With people in Nairobi tend to, in his generalization, tend to like darker colors, more subtle things. And so this is a design brand they're focused on sustainability. They do a lot of production in Kenya, bringing back cotton and leather production. But Sunny Dolet writes about it not being African enough, and how designers who are not kind of conforming to what people expect from African fashion have a hard time being marketed. Editors, stylists, they don't know what to do with them, and so they kind of fall into these cracks. But they are producing innovative fashion that does speak to some of their traditions or local productions, but they take references from all over. I mean, I think it's hard not to see Japanese references in this piece. And then leather has also been really associated with kind of pre-colonial Kenyan fashion pieces by Kenyan designers who've kind of, again, like tried to research this. But I want to just end my comment back on slide 24, because in my exhibition, I talk specifically about the Black American interpretations of African ideas and aesthetics. And I'm really interested in this specifically because you can certainly think about cultural appropriation and the Western gaze and ideas of primitivism in the ways in which Black designers since the mid-20th century have interpreted this idea of Africa. But then there's so many different layers. We think about kind of this search for severed ancestry, for severed past, but it's all mixed into this kind of colonialist gaze because often, like, these designers take an image and they run with it without actually doing a lot of research, or they use, for example, this piece on the very end in yellow. This is by Willie Posey, who's a designer working in Harlem in the 1970s. This textile includes zebras and cheetahs. This is part of a much bigger trend, and she was really trying to bring visibility to herself as a Black creative artist at this time, but she's using pre-manufactured textiles. And so in this way, she's like kind of a part of this larger trend that YSL started of like kind of using African motifs. Fun fact, Willie Posey is Faith Ringgold's mother, and she taught her how to sew and contribute to her story quilts. So she was very active in this idea of kind of shaping Black American identity and its connections to the diaspora. But fashion is not kind of a perfect or always nuanced way to think about these connections. But I find, especially in terms of African Americans' relationship with the continent, I find that to be a fascinating tension because there's so many kind of points on both sides.
Can I just add one thing? So if we go to slide 10, so Vicky, you talking about fashion that has no teeth. So I think it's also interesting to think about how African and Ghanaian designers were contributing to the global network of fashion, but that hasn't been acknowledged, right? This is a really great photograph. It's also in the exhibition. I just was doing some new research on it, so I can tell you a little bit more about it. So for a long time, I didn't know who the bride was. So just to give you a little bit of context, if you look really carefully, this bride is actually wearing a pantsuit or a jumpsuit, and this is 1972. So what I want you to think about is that in a global bridal traditions, people usually wear white wedding dresses. Wearing suits, pants in 1972, that was avant-garde globally. And yet we have this happening in Ghana, and you can imagine that in Ghana that was even more avant-garde, more controversial. So I think interesting to think about contributions to the global system. I think if we look back to history, we'll see that Africans and Ghanaians were already contributing and may have actually been the innovators. I was saying to Liz earlier today, I still don't have any evidence that there were European designers who were making bridal jumpsuits or pantsuits earlier than this. So it is entirely possible that Shea Julie, who designed this, may have actually been the first designer to create a bridal jumpsuit. And maybe she wasn't, but she was certainly part of a very avant-garde sort of generation who was thinking about things. So even though that this is not, it's not overly African, it doesn't have all these materials that we talk about, she's understanding the global system and she's thinking about ways to innovate it. And so I'll just tell you a little story. So I talked to the bride on the phone, and she still has the jumpsuit. She said she can't wear it anymore and none of her children can either, but she's keeping it, thankfully. Maybe we'll get it at the Harn, who knows? Would be great to see. And she told me that people thought she was outrageous for doing this. But she said, you know what? She said, I traveled quite a bit at that point in time. And she said, I liked wearing pants. So she went to Shea Julie and they worked together and they created this jumpsuit, which I think is pretty cool.
I think this expression of fashionable feminism is a great way to open the conversation to the audience. So if anyone have any questions or comments, please.
I'm going to take a couple of your microphones and ask you all to share. And Anna I'll get Dr. Professor Hunt over here.
First of all, thank you very much. Very stimulating. I wanted to go back to the emotion issue. And one of the first serious talks I ever heard on African art was by Jean Borgatti, quite a few decades ago here at the University of Florida. African art is not that mask on the wall. Okay. And around that time, UCLA produced a big exhibit, African Art in Motion. So the question I'm asking then, Chris has some of this in the show here, but could this be, in fact, a theme for African fashion in motion, for really a major exhibit showing a lot of different dress and people wearing it and everyday things? So that's what struck me, that the African art in motion. You're talking about African fashion in motion. Thank you.
And that's a fantastic idea. So I think what's been really exciting for me is that, and I wrote about this in an exhibition review that I wrote. So Africa Fashion was an exhibition organized by the V&A. And one of the critiques I had is that when you think about Africa fashion, it's very reductive, right? Because again, it reiterates this idea that it's this monolithic continent and it's not about countries, it's just this one continent. So what I think is exciting now is that now that show is done, we've had the Africa fashion, right? And we're having, like your show, Africa's Fashion Diasporas. I think now scholars can be invited to think about how can we nuance that. So thinking about African fashion in motion is such a fascinating idea. And we can also now turn our direction to particular cultures or countries or different versions of fashion. So I think what's really exciting about the moment now is that it's opening up conversations about where can we take African fashion next. So I think it would be great. I love that idea. I mean, don't even have an exhibit, just have people wear the fashion and it's done, right?
And I'll just add that exhibition, the curator, I think, did something really interesting. I don't remember who the filmmaker was, but she commissioned a film that played in the London installation and in Brooklyn. But I remember in the London installation, it played sort of on a screen that was sort of over your head. And what it was a video, which was, the camera never moved, but it was a series of different people dancing. I don't think there was any sound, I'm not sure, wearing some of the garments that were in the exhibition. And I thought that was great. I thought that was great because it sort of, even if you didn't have a one-to-one, like, oh, that one is over there, you saw people like reveling in these clothes. And in the Brooklyn installation, it was somewhere, but I don't remember where it was. Okay. So just to say that this is a solution that museums keep grappling with, what do we do? How do we make people understand that this would be in motion or would be used in some way? And there's always video, but often the video is just a little screen next to an object. This was a creative and different solution that I really appreciated. So there's one example. And what we have here in the Harn, I really love the video that's showing, because you told me it's Christy Brown herself produced, I guess, or had others produce their own little clips for Instagram, right? So it's showing on a screen the shape of a cell phone, but much, much bigger. And you get the sense of this is how people today are communicating about fashion, right? So to answer your question, it's a great idea. We would love to do that exhibition. We have 3 curators here.
So, good evening, and thank you for organizing this panel. I just wanted to make a brief comment about the Chez Julie bridal jumpsuit, because I'm old enough to have been in college then, and I remember the number of jumpsuits that I had at that time. So it means that this particular bride was very aware of global fashion trends, and that might have been avant-garde if she's from Ghana or wherever. So what I did want to say is I worked for the United Nations in Africa, helped to bring Namibia to independence, and worked at UN headquarters in New York. But a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my European colleagues who worked for various international agencies or NGOs, all of us, had found local tailors or local fashion designers, and they were making clothes for us using local textiles. The problem is today that a lot of those local textiles have been undermined, undercut, and taken over by cheap Chinese imports that are not of good quality. And so, that's really problematic. But as somebody who traveled the world for 40 years and who loves textiles, it's really great to see an exhibition and a panel like this. So thank you very much. And my husband's wearing his batikari, so
Saw your husband's batikari. It's really beautiful. I'm glad that you wore that this evening.
And I just want to add that Chinese manufactured cotton prints are really undercutting textile production on the continent, but also the importation of secondhand clothing is a huge issue that has undermined textile production, fashion design, across the global south, but particularly in different countries in Africa. It's also just environmental waste most of the time. So there are designers who are really focused on reviving not only the agriculture around textile production, but the weaving and the dyeing and all of that. But at this point, it is still pretty niche and still pretty expensive for the markets themselves. So I think it is something that the fashion industries there are trying to address, but it's a lot to fight against. I mean, we see it here. Like, if it's cheap on Amazon, people are going to buy it, even if we know that we should buy local. So it's definitely an issue.
I think one of the exciting things that if you go to see Liz's show in New York City, which I think everyone should go see it, one of the things that you realize is that there are a lot of young fashion designers who want to help the textile industry, right? And so they are trying to revitalize it. So I think, yes, imported textiles have undercut that, but I do think that young people are realizing the importance of woven textiles. A good example, I'm just going to switch the slide really quickly. If you go to slide number 20, so Papa Opong is a designer who's very young. I think he's 26. He graduated from FIT, and he is really interested in using the fabric that's used to make batikari, so like the gentleman's batikari smock. And he is really big on working with weavers in northern Ghana. He has it woven in particular colorways, and most of his garments incorporate that. So I mean, I think he's a good example of a designer who's really invested in and he orders directly from Ghana. So he'll travel to the country, he'll order his pieces, he'll have them maybe sewn in New York City, but it's all being woven by Ghanaians. So I do think there's a movement to try and return to some of these really beautifully hand-woven textiles. So we'll hope that, I mean, I think if people want that, then you should buy designer fashions, right, and help the industry, I would say.
Am I next? I've thought of any number of things, and you're talking. One thing that I thought about was you were talking about the European uh, fashion designers who were taking African ideas. And that made me think of, I think it was 1973 that Sieber had his exhibition on African textiles and objects of adornment at MoMA. And my understanding is that immediately as that show went up, that there were any number of designers in New York who started using African textiles, African motifs, uh, 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 not only fashion designers, but also interior designers were using different types of African textiles for throat pillows and all those sorts of things. Has anybody ever done a study of the impact of that exhibition on the fashion world, both interior design and fashion design?
I can say pretty much no. I think not. And that would be a very interesting thing to look at. It does make me think about much earlier, 1923, when the Brooklyn Museum, which was kind of ahead of its time in thinking about like art and industrial design together, did an exhibition that involved Cuba raffia textiles. And then, I guess, are you familiar with this? Bonwit Teller then commissioned designers to design women's clothing. And then this was featured in, I don't know, a Herald Tribune or something, a spread. So this was a deliberate effort on the part of the Brooklyn Museum to say, hey, American designers, there are interesting things happening in other parts of the world. You should be inspired by this, which is kind of interesting
And it
in the
goes
1920s.
and it
Yeah.
goes back even into the 1910s. There was like until the 1970s, American fashion was modeled off of Parisian fashion. Successful American designers copied French couture. That's how the industry worked. And so, in a way to kind of make American fashion more distinctive, the Brooklyn Museum was big on this. They invited designers into their collection, and their collections were African collections, South American collections, Native American collections, and said, like, Americans can come up with something new that doesn't have to follow Parisian trends. And so this idea of like primitivism was like a big source of inspiration, and how do we make it American? And so museum exhibitions have always have had a really huge impact. And I think like people, I talk to design students all the time, and they want to ask like right now, inspired by my exhibition, a cohort of design students at FIT are designing their own collections, and they talk about cultural appropriation and you know how to avoid that. And there's no like, actually there are books written about it. Susan Scafidi of the Fashion Law Institute wrote a great book, Who Owns Culture? But like taking an idea and interpreting it through your own kind of creative lens, like for example, like the boo-boos that we're looking at, Zulu beadwork, like not copying things one for one. Or, you know, if this idea of like kind of textiles, being inspired by textiles, sourcing those textiles and paying the people who make them, you know what I mean? Like there are different ways that you can engage with this. But museums have been a really important kind of part of that. I know in fashion, and it seems like interiors as well.
Mm-hmm.
What an amazing conversation that could keep going on. We're going to take one more question from Agnes, but it's the last question. I apologize, but I'm just letting everyone know because I feel like we could go on for hours.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. And I would like to end on the note of resistance and evolution. I want to take up your comment, Vicky, on Ukpo's idea that Nigerian fashion has no teeth. On the contrary, one would think and would see Nigeria as a hub of so many teeth, if you like, so much, so much material.
You're mixing your metaphors. The
I'm sorry?
hub of teeth. No, I'm kidding. Go
Yes,
ahead.
yes,
Go
I
ahead.
know,
Yeah, yeah.
but I'm just saying that it actually has so many different variety of clothing, variety of material, and your own book, your chapter actually documents that very well in terms of what you're showing in terms of the women, the woman who actually brings that on from tradition, building that on, and even going to Paris, building that on. And I don't know how he actually relates to African fashion, making it on the global scene, like you see it on Black Panther, using materials which are African material. I know our own Vicky, our own Susan here did something related to Black Panther and the materials using in that. So there's all this collection, and one would see that actually African material, and especially Nigerian material, is really on the rebound rather than not having teeth.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
wonder how you would
No.
comment. So I would
Yeah.
see that as resistance and evolution. That material actually evolves and it doesn't stay static, as you
Right.
put it.
Great question. I think he was talking mostly about one very prominent genre of fashion design being created by Nigerian designers. It was a provocative comment. And he was critiquing this notion of everybody using African print or wax print or Dutch wax print as sort of emblematic of, hey, I'm an African designer, I'm a Nigerian designer. And it's true, it does flood the markets, it does. So he's asking Nigerian designers to look beyond that. And I think he would say, I mean, he is saying, look to our history. Nigerian fashion historically has teeth, definitely. We're losing track of that, is what he's saying, and we're ceasing to do things that are distinctively Nigerian. And I think he said this was written right around the time of Black Panther. So just to use Ruth Carter's amazing costume designs as an example, I think he would have heralded that. He would. It's not like we have to say in the past, because he's, it'd be interesting to ask him, what did you think about that? Because that's a great example of somebody who did deeply researched work and didn't just copy, right? Instead, like some of the designers we've been talking about, translated and had an idea, had a point, instead of just copying. So I think he would say, yes, Nigerian fashion is evolving. And a reminder to all you young designers out there, it's not easy, right? It's not just a matter of doing what everybody else is doing. You've got to have your own concept, right? So, okay, thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to point out really quickly, sorry. In terms of talking about like resistance and things, this piece that we have in the exhibition at Papa Pong is actually drawing attention to the practice of accusing elderly women of witchcraft in Ghana, which is a human rights abuse. And so he digs very deeply into his own culture, and he thinks about the line between cultural tradition and human rights, and and real like important issues in his country. So certainly there are designers on the continent in West Africa who are doing really important work through their design practice.
Get the last word. I just wanted to go to slide 22, and I just want to leave this with everyone. Going back to this idea of fashion not having teeth. So if you look at the images, the image on the left that says detailed denim suit, 1970s, the original fashion sketch from the 1970s, and then Mali Okujetu from the 80s. I always say, if you look back to history on the African continent, designers were doing things that were avant-garde, were innovative, were creative. And I was always shocked when I met young, aspiring designers in the country, because they always said, oh, what about Dior? What about Galliano? And I said, just look at your own history. Because if you look at that, people were being so creative. So I would love to talk to that guy, because I would say, I think Nigerian Ghanaian fashion has had teeth for a very long time. And it's looking past that sort of immediate idea that, oh, it has to be print, Saint Jose may be one of the first designers to really create this patchwork denim, right? He did entire suits. So I think they've had teeth. Yeah. And I'll leave it at that.
Terrific.